In the aftermath of the Pan-Asian Coalition's failed takeover of Africa, a lull between both it and the European Union commenced, as both sides sought to regroup and replenish their existing armies. The PAC sought to fortify their acquired European territories, particularly those in the south, as they still had habitable swaths of land. Across the Mediterranean, the EU began forming plans for an operation to retake their homeland. While things were relatively quiet in Europe and North Africa, the conflict between the two factions continued on the other side of the globe, in the Pacific Ocean. The islands of the Pacific became contested battlegrounds due to their warm climates and habitable land. Thanks to their connections with the surviving nations of North America, the EU was allowed to deploy some of their military forces on islands and atolls throughout the Pacific. This was done to counter the PAC's own forces, who had already made significant gains across the ocean. In 2144, the EU forces established a secret Titan repair and rearmament base on Wake Island, with the intent of dividing PAC forces and their supply lines from the east and west of their location. The construction of the base went undetected until PAC satellites detected military activity in the region and, in response, sent in their forces to put an end to the EU occupation and its plans. A victory for the PAC forces will strengthen their supply route to the front line. A defeat will cause massive casualties caused by a lack of supplies. When the PAC strike force arrived at the Wake Atoll, they situated their Titan at the mouth of the island's bay. The Titan was far enough so that it couldn't be hit by the island's defenses, yet close enough to allow troops to launch from the Titan's pods onto the nearest beaches. If the PAC soldiers were able to secure the bunkers that guarded these beaches, they could set up vital support equipment for their commander. In order to gain full control over the island, the PAC would have to secure 6 major points, the first of which was the village. This village was located on Peel Island, which is connected to Wake Island via a nearby bridge. Mostly residents and transients reside in this village. Just east of this village, across the nearby bridge, was the checkpoint. This was an EU military outpost guarded by several troops, turrets, and vehicles, including an L5 Reisig battle walker. Just south of the village across the bay was a point simply called the Office. Just northwest of this point was a bridge that connected Wake Island to Wilkes Island. This location acted as another military checkpoint for the EU, with an office for administrative personnel. Just southeast of the office was the beach. What separated this beach from the atoll's others was the barge that had run aground there, causing the ship's cargo to fall off it. A nearby bunker guards the point from any enemy vessels attempting to land troops at this location. The most vital point the PAC needed to secure on Wake Island itself was the central dock. In years past, this was the location of an American airfield, but has since been transformed into a base for repairing and rearming EU Titans. The central dock was heavily fortified, surrounded by walls, bunkers, and guard towers. Support equipment for the EU commander was located here, along with various armored vehicles and other military equipment. The PAC strike force weren't expecting to see an EU Titan actually docked on the island. However, this did give them the opportunity to destroy, or better yet, capture the Titan. But to do so, the PAC would need to gain access to the Titan's core. Initially, it was believed this could only be done by first securing the central dock. However, the PAC commander came up with an alternative but bold plan. As soon as the EU garrison on Wake Island detected the PAC Titan in their airspace, they quickly mobilized to occupy defensive positions throughout the atoll. Seeing the PAC Titan stopped a short distance from the bay's entrance, the EU commander assumed the PAC would concentrate their forces on establishing beachheads on both Wilkes and Peel Islands. The EU forces were surprised, however, when 2 BTR-20 flying transports, escorted by a Doragon gunship, flew across the bay towards the docked EU Titan. With its shields down, the EU Titan was completely vulnerable to infantry assaults. The BTR-20s landed on the open hangar, and a couple squads of PAC troops hopped out and quickly eliminated the EU defenders. These squads then made their way through the Titan, quickly capturing its core, before moving on to take the central dock. With the central dock under threat, the EU commander pulled some of his troops from other parts of the atoll back to defend the position and retake their Titan. Seeing the EU forces pull back to their main base, the PAC commander ordered his troops to utilize their Titan assault pods and capture Peel and Wilkes Island. The PAC forces successfully did so, capturing the village, which enabled them to land more heavy equipment like tanks onto the islands to support their troops. After the village was taken, the office just across the bridge from Wilkes Island was captured shortly afterward. Thanks to reinforcements, the EU troops back at the central dock were able to contain the PAC troops within their captured Titan. By now, though, the PAC forces at the southwest part of the island had managed to capture the beach, and were beginning their assault on the central dock's walls. EU forces at the checkpoint were able to hold off coalition forces on the northern half of the island, near the bridge that connects Wake to Peel. Eventually, though, this point would also fall to the PAC. Those coalition squads that managed to capture the EU's Titan would be eliminated, but their sacrifice bought the rest of their forces time to secure the rest of the island and surround the central dock. With their Titan recaptured, the remaining EU forces used its weapons to aid in the defense of their final position. In desperation, some troops even tried using the Titan's assault pods to get behind PAC forces and retake the beach point. However, this tactic saw no success. The EU garrison continued to hold out, but they were running low on supplies and ammunition. The remaining EU troops would be pushed back into the interior of their own Titan. Realizing the futility of the situation, and knowing that reinforcements would never make it to the atoll, the EU commander ordered his forces to surrender, giving the PAC control over Wake Island. With the successful capture of Wake Island, the PAC were able to maintain their supply lines in the Pacific. While this was a blow to EU military forces in the region, back on the other side of the globe, the Union had just begun their reclamation of Europe, launching multiple assaults across the Mediterranean, concentrating the bulk of their forces in Italy. Facing the loss of their Titan, the remaining PAC forces have taken refuge in Anzio City. With the PAC having limited armor and few supplies, the EU have set an offensive move from the infamous Anzio bridgehead in the southeast. History books will call Operation Shingle the bloodiest battle in the EU campaign, causing the greatest suffering and damage to the PAC forces. After crossing the large, partially destroyed bridge, the EU force quickly established their forward base at the end of it. PAC forces had taken up various defensive positions at 6 major points throughout the city. The closest point to the EU bridgehead was called the Warehouse. There were actually 2 warehouses here, containing supplies and other equipment. This point would only be lightly defended by the PAC, as most of their troops in this area would take up positions at the second point, called the Columns. The Columns was a stack of residential buildings that seemed to act as an apartment complex. PAC troops could make use of the high ground vantage point the Columns offered to fire down at enemy troops below them at the warehouses, or along the western road beneath the monorail. Following the monorail past the Columns, one eventually reaches the third point, called the Trenches. This was named due to the long trench that runs south to north just west of the monorail. It provided cover for PAC troops to engage EU forces moving up the western road. Directly east of the trenches, on the other side of the city, was the fourth point called the Dune Shingle. Similar to the warehouse point, this location features 2 large buildings with nearby shipping containers that could provide cover for both PAC and EU troops. North of the Dune Shingle was the refugee camp. Like the Columns, this camp had residential buildings to house any refugees. Some stairs, ladders, and catwalks enabled PAC infantry to gain a high ground vantage over enemies below them. The last and most important point was the command center. This large concrete structure is where the PAC commander would direct his forces from, and use equipment to call on various means of off-map support. After establishing their bridgehead, the EU force launched their assault on the city. With their Reisig battle walkers leading the way, the EU were able to quickly capture the warehouse. EU infantry attempted to capture the Columns next, but were unable to due to the elevated advantage it gave the PAC defenders. Not wanting to get bogged down trying to take this single point, the EU split their forces to go around it and capture the other locations. They were able to quickly capture the trench northwest of the Columns. PAC forces from the command center attempted to retake it, but were rebuffed by the EU defenders now utilizing the trench. A short time later, on the east side of the city, the Dune fell to the EU. Just like the columns, the refugee camp proved more difficult to capture, but after some time, was acquired by the EU. This left the columns and the command center as the last bastions of PAC resistance. With the command center under threat of being taken, most of the troops at the column were pulled back to reinforce it, thus allowing the EU to finally capture the point. The PAC made their last stand at the command center, holding off the EU forces for as long as they could. Once EU troops were able to breach the walls around the center, storm the courtyard, and destroy the commander's support equipment, was the battle essentially over. After successfully capturing Anzio, EU forces pushed northward through Italy, retaking the rest of the country and linking up in southern France with those divisions that moved through Spain. Through the rest of 2144, EU forces continued to push northward against stiff PAC resistance, slowly retaking their homeland. While the war raged in Europe, it continued in the Pacific as well. In the early months of 2145, Earth was freezing rapidly. All remaining warm zones on the planet became heated battlegrounds. The most explosive battle of all was focused in the Hawaiian Islands. Known for their lush environments, the islands have now turned mostly to large pieces of rock. It is here on the rock of Molokai that will experience the largest engagement of the entire conflict. The EU had been to the island previously to set up a few anti-Titan missiles to protect the local populace. The Union forces ended up being shifted elsewhere, only returning once they got word that a PAC Type 2 Titan was headed to Molokai in an attempt to capture it. The EU returned with their own MH-1 Titan, just in time to see the enemy Titan deploying troops and armor on the southwest side of the island. EU troops quickly deployed their own forces on the northeast side of the island. Both factions' divisions would move out across the island attempting to capture the 5 anti-Titan missiles to destroy the other's Titans. The closest missile to the EU base was located to the east of a large bridge and had a long trench in front of it for infantry to take cover in and protect the missile from attacks. The next closest missile was to the west of the EU base, right in the middle of a toll station, with 2 lanes for vehicles to utilize when passing through said station. On the other side of the island, the first missile that was closest to the PAC base was set up in front of a large rectangular-shaped building, just at the top of a row of steps. North of the PAC base was the second closest anti-Titan missile. This missile was surrounded by a few palm trees and sat next to a large cylindrical-shaped building and a hotel. The fifth and final missile was located in the middle of the island. It was placed on the back of a concrete structure located at the south end of the main bridge. The structure faced southwest toward the PAC base. While the battle for Molokai was known as the largest engagement of the entire conflict, actual details on the battle are scarce. Both the PAC and EU captured their closest respective missiles, with much of the fighting occurring over the missile in the middle of the island. Both sides utilized their Titans to provide protection over the missiles they controlled, using the 4 turrets attached to the bottoms of each one. This prompted both sides to use their gunships to destroy these turrets, as they were unprotected by the Titan's shield. Even so, both sides would flank around the other in their attempts to secure and launch more missiles. EU forces would end up pulling through in the end, infiltrating the PAC Titan after its shields were brought down and destroying its reactor core. What was left of the PAC Titan would end up crashing on a nearby hill, being nothing more than a charred, smoldering wreck. Meanwhile, back in Central Europe, the situation had evolved. A few years into the most desperate struggle in the history of mankind, temperatures continued dropping fast, but war is setting Europe ablaze. With the bulk of the EU army mired in fierce fighting to the south, the Pan-Asian Coalition forces marched unhindered into the European heartland, seizing the most defensible urban and mountainous positions. In a desperate bid to defend their homeland, EU troops launched their Northern Strike. While the Pan-Asian Coalition had captured Central Europe during their initial campaign at the start of the war, they left the region largely undefended due to the lack of habitable land and resources, much of it completely covered by a wall of ice, stretching all the way south to the 49th parallel. However, knowing that the EU would want to retake their home countries, the PAC were content to make them pay every step of the way. Port Bavaria was originally part of a network of Titan supply stations spread throughout Europe. As the PAC army advanced in the year 2142, these stations succumbed, one after another, to the PAC forces. In 2145, the port had become the central supply station for PAC Titans patrolling the European continent. As such, it was vital for any counterattack to take control of the station and cripple PAC supply lines. An EU ground attack force entered the region and established a base a short distance away from the mountain port. This force was assigned extra AVM-2 Groundhog APCs. Once these APCs reached the base of the mountain, the troops would utilize the vehicle's assault pods to reach the Titan docking stations atop the mountain. If these stations could be captured, the EU troops could then open the doors to the tunnels at the base of the mountain to enable their battle walkers and new A3 Goliath to reach the top and support their infantry. Additionally, at the base of the mountain, near two of the tunnel entrances, were two anti-Titan missiles that would need to be captured, as the EU planned to bring in their own Titan to support the ground attack force. While there was a total of 4 docks at the mountain complex, the EU would focus on capturing the 3 nearest ones. The closest to their base was the East Dock, making it the primary target for the ground force to assault. Next to the East Dock was the Central Dock, and to the west of the Central Dock was, well, the West Dock. If the EU managed to take the docks, they would then have to capture the rest of the PAC complex. Nearest to the East Dock was the military barracks. The barracks being the closest to the East Dock meant that the PAC could quickly send reinforcements to defend it, or launch a counterattack to retake the dock. The barracks was also guarded by an anti-Titan missile. West of the military barracks, on the other side of the port, was the living quarters. The living quarters was where the port workers resided, just south of both the Central and West docks. Another anti-Titan missile was located nearby. The main gate was the final point, and was where the PAC commander conducted and oversaw operations at the port. All support equipment for the commander and various vehicles, including battle walkers and their new Type 36 Hachimoto hover attack vehicle, were located here. Just north of the main gate, in the middle of the port, was where the last anti-Titan missile was set up. Upon seeing the EU ground force enter the region and detecting a Titan close by, the PAC division requested reinforcements from one of their own nearby Titans to come and help defend the port from the impending assault. Both the PAC and EU Titans arrived to the port at the same time, with the battle well underway. The EU ground force quickly secured the anti-Titan missiles at the base of the mountain, and began launching assault pods onto the docks at the top of the mountain to capture them. PAC forces at the port had activated their own missiles, and reinforced their docks to hold off the attacking EU infantry. They were successful in holding the central and western docks. However, the EU were eventually able to take the eastern docks, and quickly move their heavy armored vehicles up through the eastern tunnel, at the base of the mountain, to the port at the top. From the eastern dock, the EU used their heavy armor to push south to the military barracks, capturing the location and the anti-Titan missile there. PAC forces from the barracks fell back to the main gate, where they were able to stymie the EU attack force. The EU troops then shifted their priorities to capturing the western half of the port, with intense fighting occurring amongst the infrastructure in the middle. The two Titans clashed in the skies just outside the port. Troops from the PAC Titan would use their assault pods to recapture the missiles at the base of the mountain, and to reinforce their own forces at the port. The EU Titan would counter the PAC one by doing the same. EU forces were able to capture both the central and west docks, but the PAC continued to put up a tenacious defense at the living quarters and main gate. The battle would continue until the EU were successful in taking down the PAC Titan. This was thanks to a squad of infiltrators who destroyed its reactor core once the shields had been taken down. With the loss of their Titan, the rest of the PAC forces retreated through the mounted tunnel at the main gate, ceding Port Bavaria to the EU. As the European counterattack progressed through Germany, the Rhine once again became a crucial defensive line. The ice valley created by the frozen river had turned into an almost impassable barrier of broken ice and crevices. On the 7th of March, 2145, exactly 200 years to the day after the 9th U.S. Armored Division crossed the Remagen Bridge during World War II, the European forces launched a bold attack across the ice fields in hope of establishing a foothold in the eastern shores of the Rhine. The EU would launch their assault from their base on the southwest side of the Rhine. They would need to capture 8 major locations to have full control over both sides of the Rhine River. The first of these was the Square, a small forward outpost situated between a couple of skyscrapers. This outpost was tasked with supporting the 2 nearby anti-Titan missiles. One was located at the Square itself, and the other was positioned southeast of the point next to the main road. Northeast of the Square was the West Bridgehead. Capturing this point would give the EU forces full control over the west side of Remagen. In between the West Bridgehead and the East Bridgehead is another anti-Titan missile, located right in the middle of the frozen river. In order to have full control over the bridge itself, the EU would have to move their forces across it and capture the East Bridgehead. It was vital that the PAC hold this point, so as not to allow the EU to establish a forward base on the east side of the Rhine. North of the East Bridgehead was the military outpost. This outpost was situated on an elevated position overlooking the main road below. This would give PAC forces a high ground advantage to fire down on EU forces below them. Stationed at the outpost was another anti-Titan missile. Directly east of the military outpost is a smaller camp called the Alley. Just like with the Square, the Alley was situated between 2 damaged skyscrapers. Thanks to some well-placed tank barriers, only infantry could reach this point. North of the Alley was the park. The primary feature of this point was the square-shaped statue in the middle of it. Not much is here, with the exception of a couple turrets and boxes of supplies. East of the park and north of the military outpost was the hotel. The hotel was used by the PAC as a makeshift military barracks and staging ground for their infantry. The last anti-Titan missile was located right in front of this hotel. The final point under the PAC's control on the west side of the Rhine was the monorail station. This acted as the primary base for the PAC forces in the region. Battle walkers and support equipment for the PAC commander were located here. Reinforcements could possibly be brought in from outside the battlefield to the northeast via the monorail station. Before the battle even started, the PAC attempted to destroy the bridge using explosives. They were only partially successful, given that the EU forces could just cross the frozen river itself. The EU would bring in a Titan to support their offensive, flying downstream above the river from the south. Likewise, the PAC would bring in their own Titan to support their defenses, flying upstream from the north. The EU would quickly capture the Square north of their main base, securing the 2 anti-Titan missile silos nearby. PAC troops at the Square fell back to the West Bridgehead, hoping to hold out long enough for reinforcements to arrive from the east side of the river. Unfortunately, those reinforcements wouldn't arrive in time, with the EU quickly overwhelming the defenders at the West Bridgehead. With the West Bridgehead lost, the PAC forces on the east side dug in so as to keep the EU on the west side. Not wanting to lose the momentum, the EU charged across the bridge, crashing into the PAC defenses. Despite the PAC's defenses at the bridgehead, the EU were able to capture the point, establishing a foothold in the east. Breaking out of this foothold would prove difficult though, as the EU took heavy casualties trying to take the nearby military outpost, while receiving harassing fire from PAC troops at the Alley. The EU decided to shift their forces to go around the military outpost, capturing the Alley, and then moving on to take the park to the north. From here, the EU would assault and capture the hotel, fully surrounding the bulk of the PAC forces at the military outpost. Cut off from the monorail station, they'd be unable to receive reinforcements. The PAC Titan attempted to provide some support, though it was tied up doing battle with the EU Titan. Eventually, the military outpost would fall to the EU. The monorail station would fall soon afterwards, and with the EU having control over both sides of the Rhine River, the PAC Titan would withdraw from the battlefield, heavily damaged by the now EU-occupied anti-Titan missiles. The EU Titan was in no better condition to pursue, due to the damage it too sustained during the battle. By the late summer of 2145, the EU had managed to push the PAC back through Western Europe, and now the heartlands of Old East Germany and the state of Saxony lay before them. As the Arctic winter, which prohibited any troop movement with its freezing temperatures and harsh weather conditions, drew closer, the Central European High Command ordered their armies to attack the city of Leipzig, the last stronghold of the PAC forces in Europe. Under the cover of darkness, the EU began to infiltrate the frozen labyrinth of buildings. From their primary base in the south, the EU would need to capture 6 major points in order to liberate the city of Leipzig from the PAC. Directly north of the EU base was the first point, the East Bridge. Not much was located here, save a couple of residential buildings, some shipping containers, and a rack of assault pods, salvaged from the husk of a nearby Titan, destroyed some time before the Great Battle for Leipzig. The West Bridge was the second point just northwest of the EU base. The primary feature of this point was the frozen playground located next to it, with some tank barriers to stop or slow vehicles. Both the West and East Bridge points were on the southern side of what looks to be the Elster Basin, an artificially created river basin now completely frozen over. Across the East Bridge is the Grand Park. Part of this park is completely covered by the nearby Titan husk. The part that is still intact has a couple of buildings and supply crates, perhaps used by the PAC to salvage parts from the Titan. West of the Grand Park and north of the West Village is the main square, used as a large forward staging area for the PAC's forces stationed in the city. Further west of the main square was the fuel depot. The fuel depot was an important strategic location for the PAC, where they would refuel, rearm, and repair their armored vehicles. The last point for the PAC was the Monument Park. This is where the Coalition commander would use support equipment to coordinate and conduct all military operations throughout the city. The EU High Command thought that by attacking the city at night, they could catch the defending garrison by surprise. However, the PAC were more than prepared for the EU assault. Union forces quickly secured the east and west bridgeheads without too much resistance. Once they crossed the bridges to the other side of the canal was when all hell broke loose. PAC infantry ambushed EU forces, opening fire on them from amongst the buildings and ruins of the city. EU forces would be pushed back across the bridges and have to regroup for a renewed assault. The battle for Leipzig would become a grueling slog, as both forces engaged each other in intense urban combat. Despite the stiff resistance put forward by the PAC, the EU slowly gained ground, capturing the Grand Park, which enabled their forces to attack the main square from both the east and south. The main square would change hands between both the EU and PAC several times, before the EU were finally able to solidify their hold on the position. The A3 Goliath was a defining factor that enabled Union forces to make progress through the city. Thanks to the vehicle's heavy regenerative armor and armament of machine gun and grenade launcher turrets, it could absorb the brunt of enemy fire, protecting squads behind and inside the vehicle. By the time the PAC figured out the Goliath's weaknesses and began to exploit them, the EU had already taken much of the city, including the valuable fuel depot. The remaining defenders made their last stand at the Monument Park, which the EU eventually captured, bringing the battle to an end. With the successful liberation of Leipzig came the end of the EU's Northern Strike Offensive. While the offensive allowed the EU to retake much of Western Europe, the strain on man and material was costly, so much so that they would be unable to mount a similar offensive. This was in addition to the harsh Arctic winter that would soon set in, causing both sides to put a halt to any substantial military operations in Europe. However, the Cold War wasn't yet over, as both the Pan-Asian Coalition and European Union continued their fight elsewhere across the globe, from the deserts of the Middle East to the Northwest Territories of Canada.